The movie begins at a cutting-edge research facility where scientists are working on harnessing magnetic energy as a new, powerful source of clean energy. Led by the ambitious Dr. Michael Edwards, the team prepares for a critical experiment to demonstrate the feasibility of this energy source. The atmosphere is tense but hopeful. However, the experiment goes wrong. The magnetic energy spirals out of control, creating a massive swirling vortex of metallic debris and intense electromagnetic forces. This destructive metal tornado quickly grows in size and power, threatening to devastate everything in its path. Stephen calls Jonathan to notify him of a critical issue. Frustrated and unable to hear clearly, Jonathan dismisses Stephen's concerns. Stephen explains he has replicated a Helios energy receptor, but warns the design is flawed with significant side effects. Annoyed, Jonathan reminds Stephen that the project's delays and near loss of funding were partly his fault and tells him not to call again. Despite Stephen's plea about the risk, Jonathan assures him that all precautions have been taken and ends the call abruptly. Meanwhile, Michael informs the team they are on target for the next day's solar flare, confirming readiness to input new data. During class, the teacher noticed Nick Edwards was distracted and confronted him with a question about electromagnets. Despite initially seeming unprepared, Nick accurately explained the two classes of electromagnets. Impressed, the teacher continued the lesson. However, Nick played a prank by plugging in a machine that blew air into the teacher's face. Michael arrived to pick up his son, Nick, who had been suspended for the prank. Nick tried to downplay the incident, but Michael scolded him for his behavior. He reminded Nick that Rebecca would be coming to Ron's birthday party and emphasized that he should be respectful. Authorities questioned Elisa about Stephen's experiment. She informed them that Stephen had been working independently. Although his last contract ended 2 years ago, Stephen owned patents that generated income, allowing him to work on his own. Winters, one of the investigators, asked Elisa if she had any idea what might have caused the incident. Elisa suggested that something must have gone wrong with the experiment, possibly a power surge or a containment breach. She mentioned that Stephen had been secretive about his work in the last few months, but had indicated he was close to a breakthrough. At Ron's birthday party, Rebecca received a call from Greg, who praised their work and told her to get ready for the next day. She rejoined Michael, Ron, and Nick, where Michael noted the upcoming day's significance. Ron confirmed their readiness, despite Michael's concerns about the risks of siphoning ionized particles from the stratosphere. Rebecca reassured them, explaining that their method had no negative effects and that the magnetic field was fully contained, providing clean energy. The next day, Jonathan introduced Dennis Porter, the new fund manager, to Greg and Michael Edwards, the resident astrophysicist. Michael confirmed their readiness during the sun's peak solar cycle with daily solar flares. He explained that their satellites would absorb the solar particles, convert them into magnetic energy, beam them to receptors, and store them as electricity in underground capacitors. Dennis was impressed and asked how close they were. Greg confirmed they were moments away, with Rebecca ensuring the panels were in position. They initiated the process, with energy absorption and the magnetic vortex performing as expected. Suddenly, there was a spike in containment unit. Michael managed to stabilize the situation by reducing vortex flow from a satellite. Meanwhile, a man in the woods saw his chainsaw fly into the air. Jonathan reassured Dennis that it was a minor mishap. Rebecca reported reaching full capacity and initiated the shutdown sequence. The team applauded their success. Later, a man drinking water saw his bike move on its own and get absorbed by the magnetic field. Elisa called Jonathan to inform him about her husband Stephen's finding. Megan answered the phone and called for Jonathan, but he didn't want to talk to Elisa. Despite Elisa's attempt to convey the urgent news that Stephen had died and that the Helios project was dangerous, Megan hung up on her. Greg and Michael discussed the 2% energy loss. Greg insisted it was acceptable, while Michael was incredulous since their simulations had never shown such a discrepancy. Greg pointed out this was the first real-world test of Helios and that they now knew 2% of the download would dissipate. Michael highlighted that the lost energy could power 10,000 houses for a year. Greg agreed to investigate, but emphasized running a diagnostic on the sensors first. Michael suggested discussing the issue with Jonathan, but Greg reassured him, reminding him they had solved the world's energy crisis and were now considered heroes. At a store, every metal object suddenly moved and radio signals were disrupted. People freaked out and ran back into the store. Metal cans began to be absorbed into the air, and one hit the storekeeper, causing him to pass out. Others hid under a cabinet. Suddenly, everything became silent. silent. A woman cautiously went out to check what had happened. Michael received a call from an officer at the scene of the store incident. The people who were in the store explained what had happened, describing the sudden movement of metal objects and the disruption of radio signals. The officer then told Michael that he should come and check out what was going on. In another part of the town, on a farm, the magnetic field became active. The owner, working on his car, noticed a metal tornado forming, attracting all metal objects. His car started moving towards the tornado, stumbling upon him. Michael and Rebecca arrived to find distressed people and the sheriff trying to maintain order. Witnesses reported a strange hum before everything shook, debris flew, and vehicles moved as if dragged by an unseen force. Despite no wind, the sheriff's theory was dismissed as paranormal. Tensions flared, with Larry and Stan arguing until the sheriff intervened, apologizing for Larry's reliability. Michael noticed all debris was pulled in one direction, affecting only metal objects, while wooden structures remained intact. The incident occurred at 10:32 a.m., as evidenced by stopped watches. Michael theorized the force was magnetic, possibly linked to their project, and the 2% loss of magnetic energy from 4 hours earlier, despite being 15 miles from their array. Rebecca and Michael investigated the area, checking until Rebecca's compass needle stopped spinning about 50 yards apart. An officer asked if they had figured anything out, noting they'd been at it for an hour. Michael determined the magnetic field was about half the size of a football field and seemed to be moving. The officer received a call about another incident. Michael called Greg to inform him, suggesting they might have discovered the missing 2% of energy, speculating it had transformed into a roving magnetic vortex. Back at the lab, Greg expressed skepticism about Michael's theory, cautioning against acting without proof of the project's connection to the incident. Michael argued that nothing else could have caused the damage, but Greg insisted on waiting for concrete evidence. The metal tornado grew stronger, pulling objects with increasing force. Michael informed Jonathan that the magnetic energy had overloaded their collection receptors, but they managed to contain and compensate for the overload, considering the download success. Jonathan pointed out the issue of the missing 2% of energy, speculating it might have split off before their failsafe activated. Michael argued that a rogue magnetic vortex could have been created in a fraction of a second, something they hadn't monitored for due to its improbable odds. He insisted the events pointed directly back to their project. Greg expressed serious doubts about Michael's theory, arguing that even if the surge had created a rogue magnetic vortex, it wouldn't sustain itself and would die out almost immediately. Michael suggested it could be feeding off ionized particles in the outer atmosphere. However, Jonathan left without giving any solution. Michael called Officer Joe Riley to check for any new unexplained phenomena. Joe mentioned cases of phone disruptions and a local farmer almost hit by his tractor, now in the hospital. Michael confirmed he could be there in 45 minutes. Joe, who had contacted the governor's office, noted state investigators would arrive by the next day. Michael urged Joe to keep looking for proof and said he was heading into town. Joe and Michael visited the farmer, who described the tornado's appearance. While they were talking, Nick arrived with Shane, who was also injured by debris from the tornado. Nick explained the situation outside, prompting Michael to investigate further. Michael and Rebecca decided to hack into Helios to get security footage, and Nick offered his help. He successfully hacked into the system and handed the computer to Michael. The next day, Michael called Greg to show him security camera playback from the outer collection receptors. Greg suggested the footage might show signal distortion, but Michael insisted it could be the proof they needed. He urged Greg to delay the French download until they figured it out. Greg agreed to look into it and promised to get back to Michael. Megan called Michael and told him to contact Elisa. Meanwhile, Greg went to Jonathan to report more magnetic anomalies and hospitalizations since the power surge. Greg suggested postponing the French project to focus on the current issues. Jonathan dismissed the idea, emphasizing the need to appear strong before going public. He declared that Michael would no longer work with the company, labeling him a liability, and insisted any investigation would only happen after their commercial contract was signed and the press conference. Ron was also trying to figure out what was happening. He discussed his findings with Rebecca and promised to update her on any new developments. Meanwhile, Michael met with Elisa. She showed him Steven's findings, and Michael asked for a copy of the data from the computer. Michael then called Greg to inform him that Steven was dead and that the vortex was being caused by their project. Ron informed Rebecca that the iron ore runs along volcanic shelves, creating a path of least resistance leading directly to Henderson. Rebecca called Michael to relay this, and he confirmed the sheriff couldn't evacuate the area. They agreed to meet at Helios Helios, with Rebecca printing and sending the data to Michael and Greg. Rebecca planned to review Winters' data for a solution, despite the risks. She asked to speak with Nick, urging him to take care of her and himself. Nick promised to do so, and Michael assured her he would call again soon. Joe instructed the other officers to contact radio and TV stations to broadcast an alert about the approaching tornado. He advised people to seek shelter in basements and drawers, preferably in wooden structures, as they were safer. Jonathan approached Greg, informing him of an error in the receptors and insisting they report it to the public and warn authorities and people in the tornado's path to stop it. Greg, concerned about limiting the crisis and the upcoming press conference, hesitated, emphasizing the gravity of their creation. As they discussed, Michael called Greg. Michael explained that the magnetic field was heading towards Henderson and could hit the city at any moment. Evacuation wasn't possible, so they needed to issue a warning. Michael warned that Henderson was at great risk of being ruined. Michael saw the tornado in front of him and quickly hung up the phone to get away. He took shelter under a bridge. The people of the town, hearing the warning, also ran to take shelter. Nick and Rebecca got into the car, but as they were driving, the car started getting pulled by the magnetic field. They managed to jump out just before the car was snatched away. They then took refuge in a nearby church. At the church, the building started collapsing, and Nick got trapped under the debris. Michael called Ron, urgently asking if he had heard about Henderson. Ron confirmed it was hit by a tornado and shared that he had discovered the magnetic field was heading towards Philadelphia, following a 400-meter thick iron ore vein. Michael stressed the need to evacuate due to the field's potential to gain tremendous speed. Rebecca and the pastor lifted the debris off Nick. Though injured, he managed to get up and was okay. Michael went to the lab and explained that their actions were causing the magnetic disturbances. Jonathan suggested different solutions, but Michael told him they wouldn't work. Michael proposed a plan to stop the magnetic field completely by slowing down the flow of magnetism for a few seconds. He suggested using powerful electromagnetic radiation, EMP, sent directly into the ground's core. They contacted the Pentagon to arrange for 2 drones to drop the EMP bombs. Meanwhile, another team reported that a similar tornado was heading towards Paris. They attempted to stop it with an EMP bomb as well, but the tornado reached the city before the drones arrived, causing massive destruction, including the Eiffel Tower. 2 drones were dispatched toward Philadelphia. 1 drone failed, but the other successfully launched the EMP bomb, dissipating the magnetic field and stopping the tornado. The team congratulated each other. Greg then reported that the second tornado in Paris had also been stopped successfully. Michael then went to find Rebecca and Nick. The aftermath saw the team reflecting on their ordeal. Jonathan accepted responsibility for the disaster and resigned. The movie concludes with Michael, Rebecca, Nick, and Ron having a meal together, a moment of relief and contemplation after their harrowing experience, while a news report in the background details the events and Jonathan's resignation. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our recap. Watch our next videos on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you on the next one.